Hello, everyone. Be very welcome to this sixth session of the second edition of the STS Colloquium, in which we're going to discuss social technical transitions. I am Professor Rafael Diaz from the University of Campinas. I'll be sharing this session today. And here with us, we have Dr. Enriquez Hosgens and Professor Roberto Rivas. Uh, our first our first speaker will be Dr. Rick Hosgens, who is a researcher from the Social Research Center at TU Dortmund, working with transformative governance in cities and regions, focusing his works on social innovation, sustainability transitions, climate change adaptation, transdisciplinary research, and STS studies. So, welcome, Dr. Hosgens. I'll handle you the virtual stage.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation. Um, yeah, thanks for the introduction. You already mentioned especially social innovation and transitions. That will be the parts I'll be focusing on today. With a bit more of a theoretical perspective, looking at how social innovations can potentially contribute to sustainability transitions and which role they could have therein. Tiago, if you could start sharing the screen. Thank you. Um, yeah, so as I already mentioned, talking about social innovation and, well, the potential role for social innovation in and for sustainability transitions. Yeah, we have to be a bit critical about the role and the possibilities of social innovation, but I think it does play an important role in sustainability transitions, and that's what I'm going to try to highlight today. So I just structured the slides a little bit around the questions of why, what, and how, and I will finish with a bit of a research agenda, at least topics that I'm working on that I think need to be developed further. So why do we need social innovation, especially in connection to sustainability transitions? Well, the simple answer that I will work out a little bit more in the coming slides, but is that technological innovations alone simply won't suffice. We need also social change. We need changes of social practices. But that brings us to the question of what, because if we look at social innovation, it's a very, well, it's actually a rather vague term. At least it's used in many different ways in different contexts. So I'll there give a little bit more background on the concept of social innovation, work towards my definition of social innovations as a change of practices. And of course, in relation to sustainability transitions, then we should talk about changes towards less resource intensive practices in particular. An important point there is then the question how. So we hear a lot of talk about we need more social innovation. Social innovation plays an important role in many different areas, not only sustainability, not only climate change, also in healthcare. It's a concept that's mentioned a lot, and in various other areas. But the question is how, and how can social innovation really have an impact? And there I will talk a bit about practice theory, a practice theory perspective, with a focus on windows of opportunity, which is a concept I borrow mainly from multi-level perspective. And what I will argue then is that we do not only need socio-technical transitions, but also what I call social transitions, where it's about the embedding of social innovations in societal structures. So that just is a bit of an overview. Let's start with the why question. So I already mentioned technological innovations alone won't suffice. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but let's first have a look at this quote. It says, the need will quickly become evident for social innovation to match technological change or technical change. A radical reform of institutions and political processes at all levels, including the highest, that of world polity. Where it is a more interactive session, I would immediately ask, any ideas where this quote comes from? Because at least when I found it, I was quite surprised to see how old this quote actually is, given that it's actually mentioned in the Limits to Growth report by the Club of Rome. So it's 50 years old. 50 years ago already, there was a mentioning of social innovation and a mentioning of a need that should quickly become visible for social innovation. And while we see that, especially over the last 10 years or so, social innovation is really booming, but it's been taking quite a long time before the role of social innovation has really been recognized. A second quote in this area, it's a little long for on a slide, but I like to share it, by Schotten and Steinmüller, who focus mainly on science, technology, and innovation policy. But they, especially Johan Schott, of course, come from a socio-technical transitions perspective, from multi-level perspective, and there the focus has always been on technological innovations and the question how more sustainable technological innovations can be implemented or can find their place in society. And what is nice about this quote, I think, is that it makes clear also that social innovation plays a role there. So they mentioned at the very end that these processes, they involve social innovation, since it focuses on many social elements and their relations with technological opportunities. So there is still very much the technological focus, but at least it's clear that we also need social change alongside technological innovations, and maybe even also separate from technological innovations. We need social change that may not be linked specifically to a technological change, but much more to a practice change. So we see that there is, in this area of socio-technical transitions, increasing acceptance of social innovation, so to say. But yeah, the argument technological innovations alone won't suffice. I don't know if this picture is familiar to anybody, but it shows the character of technological optimism, which comes from a paper by Lamb and colleagues, who look at discourses of climate delay, and they identify technological optimism along different other discourses of delay as one of the reasons why people, or one of the discourses, one of the excuses rather maybe, of why people don't act towards more sustainable practices, with the argument of, okay, technology will solve it, we'll find technological solutions, electric cars and whatever other technologies that may still be in the pipeline that help us get over these challenges of sustainability, of climate change. And in that sense, it's a German quote here, but I really like it a lot, by Peter Altmaier, then minister in the German government, about the new climate strategy, and he says, I bet on our aim for the geniuses of our engineers. So basically what that says, okay, climate strategy, we don't have to think too much about it, we just have to give money to our engineers, maybe in universities, maybe also in companies, car industry important in Germany. They'll find a solution to all our problems. It's a little bit exaggerated, of course, but it's a kind of discourse that takes all responsibility away from individuals, from individual practices, and well, basically says we don't have to change our practices at all. Whereby Lamb and colleagues make very clear that yeah, these are just discourses of delay. They just delay our reaction as society. They delay our response to actually change practices towards sustainability. So again, an argument of why just technological innovations alone won't suffice, because they delay action. They don't work towards change. So that's the one side of the coin. The other side is that we also see that there's lots of technological development that's not actually going in the direction of sustainability. Here, a paper by Untitled et al., who discuss these negative trends. They mentioned, for instance, also the trends towards bigger cars, SUVs, that well, they just go against all trends in the sense of sustainability, of using less resources, using less energy intensive products, and we see that there's just really a growing trend there. And the other example they also mentioned shortly is the idea of space travel, and we see here, there was in the news, at least on CNN a couple of weeks ago, as a kind of advertisement. Apparently this company aims to open a space hotel already in 2025, And of course, if our practices move towards going on holidays in Spain and on holidays in space, that's of course not a sustainable practice, and again can be a big impact on our environment. So also here we need to think about practice change. So I'm not going to say that social innovation is the solution here, or that it's about social innovation, but it's about social practices, it's about behavior. And again, there we cannot assume that a pure technology focus is going to solve our sustainability and climate change problems, because we see also these negative trends. And as I looked this up, I was quite amused to find this picture actually of a future astronaut, which reminded me of the idea that when I was little, growing up in the Netherlands, we used to, in summer holidays, we used to drive to France or maybe Spain or Italy, a few 100-kilometer car ride. That was normal at the time. Nowadays, it's rather normal to fly to, I don't know, Southeast Asia or something on a holiday, so to take the plane. And what if really there's a generation of kids growing up for whom it's normal to make actually these space voyages? That's a rather scary thought. And again, here we need to think about social practices, and it's also about what's normal in society. How do we deal with certain phenomena, and which changes of practices are necessary there? There we see that there may actually be negative trends or technologies that are developing that are not sustainable. But what we also notice, of course, is that sustainable technologies often need a change of practice. And I brought two examples here. The first, electric mobility, that of course stays very clear to existing practices. So we still use our car, we can still do our groceries, bring the kids to kindergarten or whatever. So we can stay very close to existing practices. Maybe the only problem is that the range is a bit smaller, so we can't go on holidays with it, or we need to find other solutions in terms of driving longer distances. Maybe we need to get used to longer breaks. So the change of practice there is actually relatively small. If you were to go a step further towards even more sustainable technology, we would go towards something like cargo bikes, maybe, where we see on the right-hand side, women bringing our kids, I don't know where, probably to school possibly, or at least transporting kids in a bike. And that, of course, is a much bigger change of practice again. So it's about firstly putting physical effort in, bringing the kids. It's going to take more time than a car, probably, depending on the city where you live. Of course, this is a picture from the Netherlands, so it's also, of course, a culture thing where it's much more easy to integrate cargo bikes into the existing practices in the Netherlands than it is, for instance, in Germany, where you also see this trend emerging, but it's much smaller and slower than in the Netherlands. But again, the main issue that I want to share here is that, also these sustainable technologies, they need changing practices. They may need social innovation, again, depending on how you define social innovation, whether how big you have to see the concept. But the main thing is at least that we need changing practices, we need changing behavior. And at the development where I think this is very interesting, and from my point of view too little addressed, is the area of the circular economy, where you can find nice pictures like this about reuse of material. And what is hardly ever addressed is how to actually manage the waste. So there's different waste management and waste separation systems in place, of course, in various places. But I like, for instance, these kind of messages that are nowadays on many packages, at least here in Germany, that tell you to actually separate the lid from the bottle, and then you have to throw it in the same recycling bin. And this is a very small change of practice for those who actually do separate the lid. But it's something that is necessary in order to be able to really properly reuse the materials. If the plastic is not separated properly, it's all going to be ending up on the same pile where you have lower quality plastics, or in the worst and probably most common case, where it's actually just going to get burned and just take the energy out of the material, but we cannot reuse the actual material. So here we also see that we need changes of practices that go along with the technological innovation that is the main discourse behind circular economy and the separation of waste and the reuse of material. So that about why technological innovations alone won't suffice. What we need is a change of practice, a change of behavior. And so the question becomes, how does social innovation play a role in there? And then the main question, at least also from a theoretical perspective and looking at the literature, actually addresses the question of what are actually really social innovations, because as I mentioned, the concept is booming. It's all around us nowadays, at least that's what it feels like when you do research in this area. But yeah, how can we define it? How can we grasp it? So again, the what question, what is social innovation? And before I go a little bit more into that, I want to share with you just 2 comments that I got after submitting not real papers, more viewpoints, opinion articles on the role of social innovation in transition to this journal, Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions, the main journal in the transition area. And I submitted something there twice with a kind of big gap in between, both times for a sort of special issue to react on the research agenda, and one to reflect when the journal existed 10 years, I think. But what we see is the feedback, not saying that my papers are particularly brilliant or had to be accepted, but what I like about the feedback, or not so much like, but what's informing, is that it's the first one, the term social innovation seems to be used in very different and often vague ways by distinct authors, casting serious doubt on its usefulness. And that's, of course, a thing that we as social innovation scholars have to take very serious, because, again, I think it's an important concept. It can play a big role, especially if we look at changing practices. But we have to see, like, can we use the term social innovation? And in a second attempt, so to say, the feedback was that your research suggestion seemed very general and abstract. And with hindsight, I have to totally agree, but that was also my goal to a certain extent, only a few pages, to describe what social innovation can contribute, what the role of social innovation can be. And yeah, then you have to mention lots of different perspectives and have to be rather broad in describing what social innovation is about. And yeah, the quote here continues that it's possibly related to the problem that the concept of social innovation means empirically vague and hard to pin down. And that is simply true. And again, something that we have to keep in mind. But I'm mentioning this because it's especially in relation to transition theory and sociotechnical transition literature. It's a bit of a challenge to locate social innovation and to bring social innovation into the discourses. That is, of course, indeed not helped by the fact that there are lots of different definitions out there of social innovation. So Edward Schachter and Wallace, they find over 250 definitions. And note that this was published in 2016. And if you look at the number of publications that have been written about social innovation, then you see that there's a huge takeoff actually around 2015, 2016. So they actually included a minority of the papers that are out there nowadays, and you see in many that still try to define social innovation. You also see that many don't even try to define social innovation, take it for granted, but yeah, it's often vaguely defined and with different viewpoints. And we see then in various review papers, again, they're also a little bit older, but I think it still holds that we see that there's different clusters being built around different understandings of social innovation, different uses of social innovation. So there one also, of course, has to find its own place. But it doesn't help, especially for a broader audience, if there are these different clusters with different understandings of social innovation that are all being put forward. And adding to this, I, together with a colleague, reviewed a number of sustainable social innovations from a project called CASI, where a lot of sustainable innovations were collected, and they were grouped along categories of technological innovation, social innovation, business innovation, and a few others. And we focused on the social innovations, but what became apparent there is that on the one hand, there is the social innovations as change towards sustainable practices. That's what I've been showing in my first couple of slides mainly. But what we also saw was that an innovative co-creative process was often called social innovation. So then it's about transdisciplinary projects, co-creation with citizens, bring different stakeholders together to think about, well, in this case, sustainability or climate change related problems. And the solutions that they may come up with may be very technical or maybe really business innovations, but the process of co-creation is already seen as social innovation. So that is, of course, another practice of making innovations. So in that sense, it's also social innovation in line with the first definition. But again, we see a wide diversity of what social innovation can be. It can be a change of practice, kind of individual that others may copy and may adopt. But it may also just be about this way of working together, this process of creating innovation. Adding a little bit again to the diversity in the literature, but I think it's good to paint a broad picture also here. We see, for instance, a paper by Mumford from 2002, so really early on in the debate on social innovation and before this real boom started. But what he says is that social innovations are actually relatively rare events. And he refers then to examples like the establishment of the IMF or the ideas of Henry Ford about production. And these are, of course, large changes of practice, but also not only changes of practice, also the establishment of new institutions, but yeah, huge, relatively rare events indeed. But if you compare that to initiatives such as the Atlas of Social Innovation that colleagues here at the Social Research Center have been working on a few years ago, or also the European Social Innovation Database that is still under development, we see that these databases, they map a whole lot of cases. So the European Social Innovation Database actually maps cases worldwide, but there's a bit of a bias still towards European cases. They found over 5,000 different kinds of social innovation. So pretty much the opposite of the big ideas that Mumford talks about. They include things, for instance, like repair cafes, but they would then also make a different entry for repair cafe in Dortmund or in Vienna or in whichever city. So you see that there is an understanding of social innovation as new initiatives, very small scale initiatives, versus this idea of large scale societal changes that Mumford has in mind. So again, sketching how broad and undefined the concept can indeed be in the literature. And what we see, maybe a bit as a reaction to that, I'm not sure, but that especially politically, but also increasingly academically, there is a kind of a normative instrumentalization of social innovation. So the idea of that social innovations are good. We need social innovations. Social innovations can help us deal with 10 years ago the financial crisis, where the concept of social innovation started to be mentioned a lot, but also in relation to climate change, to inequality and inclusivity. There is this idea that social innovation is necessarily good and necessarily helpful. And this, I think, is something that we have to be very careful about, because I think, as with any innovation, also social innovation may have negative impacts on certain social groups. And they actually almost certainly have an impact on certain social groups, because it's about changing practices, it's about doing things differently, and there will be winners and there will be losers, especially when it's about sustainability, transition to sustainability. If you all stop using our car, of course, car manufacturers are not going to be happy about these changes of social practices, these social innovation. So it's very important there, I think, is that we need a kind of symmetric approach, which I borrow from Bloor's work, where we do not define social innovations in a normative way, but look very symmetrically at what is actually a social innovation. It's a change of practice, and that can have both positive and negative impacts on different actors. And that I think is crucial in understanding how social innovations can grow, how they can diffuse, but also in how they can play a role for sustainability transitions, because then we are not assuming that they're good per se, but we are acknowledging that there may be winners and losers of these changes. And then also ideas like the multi-level perspective that I'll go into in a bit can play a role and can help us in our understanding of diffusion dynamics. So the definition that I use very much related to definition by Holt and Schwartz that is mentioned a lot in the literature, but that goes towards the idea that social innovation should be understood as an analytical concept for sociological research. And then it refers to innovation, which the locus of innovation can above anything be found in the social realm. So it's not about technological change, but it's about the social elements of the innovation, social practices and behavior. Yeah, social innovation is about changing social practices, and it doesn't matter in which direction they're being changed. If they're being changed and by a larger group, if there is a diffusion, we can speak of a social innovation, whether it's beneficial or not. Does principle not play a role? Then we can then, of course, start the study of, how does this contribute to social innovation. And that also brings me to the next part of my talk. So about the how question: how does social innovation fit in sustainability transitions? What role can it play in sustainability transitions? And then I want to just very shortly mention first the kind of theoretical background on sociotechnical transitions as laid out by especially Frank Geels and Johan Schott. And what we see here on the right-hand side of the slide is the concept of so-called multi-level perspective, where they basically maintain that there is a certain socio-technical regime, so always defined around the technology in their work. So it can be the regime of car mobility, but it can also be a regime about food production and consumption. And that regime is inherently stable because there are forces at play that reinforce each other. So the manufacturers within the regime, they need maybe suppliers, they need customers, they need politics, and vice versa. Politics needs manufacturing companies because they create jobs and so forth. So there is a relatively stable regime. And what they say, there have been a lot of variations on this model, and it's been developed much further over the last couple of years. But the basic idea is that the regime can be broken up or destabilized if there are landscape pressures coming from the outside. So especially, of course, the idea of climate change plays an important role there, but also more sudden shocks like the war in Ukraine that impacted, at least for instance, the mobility regime in the sense that gasoline became more expensive, maybe the heating as gas became more expensive or less available, and so forth. And so then the regime can open up, and the idea is that niche innovations can then rival the existing regime. And I very much like this logic because I think it can be applied also to social innovation to a very large extent, in the sense that if we understand existing practices, and that's usually a complex of practices, in a similar way as a regime, then we can ask, like, how do we get to the point where practices start changing? And these new practices, they may be kind of niche practices, especially if a small group already adopts them, but how can we reach the majority to actually adopt them? That's an important question that I think has not been addressed sufficiently yet in the literature, but where I think this kind of thinking along the lines of the socio-technical transitions can help us a long way. Whereby we also must, of course, acknowledge then that this transition may also involve technologies, but as I mentioned already, also sustainable technologies may need social innovations to accompany them, changes of practices. So there, this social innovation also enters this model along the line of the quote by Schott and Steinmüller that I started with. So very shortly, just to sketch a bit more the background of the transition theory, and a longer quote here where I cut parts out, but from Geels and Schott. and they see transitions as coevolution processes that require multiple changes in socio-technical systems. So this example of using cargo bike to bring kids to school, it's not only about using the bike, it's also about probably leaving the house a little earlier, so that might influence the practices of having breakfast with the family at home. It may even influence the ability to actually reach work in time. And of course, then if you don't reach work in time, there may be structures at play that actually don't allow you to change your practice towards using a cargo bike instead of a car. So we see here that also these social innovations require multiple changes in multiple practices. There are multi-actor processes for technological innovations, for social innovations, if we see them as a bit more radical, larger changes that also plays a role, and they also entail interactions between different social groups. Here, of course, there's a question of definition. So if we take a definition of social innovation as a small-scale initiative, there's usually also multiple actors involved, but of course, it's less radical changes than what the transition perspective is after. Yeah, transitions are about radical shifts. So some social innovations are, most are not. So that's important to keep in mind. But what is especially important here is the comment that transitions are long-term processes. And this, I think, is very important to realize for social innovation as well. It's a topic that is often neglected, it seems, at least in literature. It's not really discussed. But the very few historical case studies about social innovations, they show that the social innovation process, the fusion of a social innovation, really takes a long time. And we're talking about multiple decades to really institutionalize. So that's important to keep in mind if we talk about sustainable practices, about practices that contribute towards transition to sustainability. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, I take what I call a social perspective, borrowing also from the socio-technical perspective, where the idea is that technologies are technologies in context. And I think that's a very important realization from transition theory about asking how can technology be integrated in existing regimes. How do practices have to change? How do maybe also rules have to change, regulation have to change? And that's a very important question for social innovations as well. They also take place within a context. And here's where I draw on practice theory. So especially the work by Schoaf and colleagues and Reckwitz and some others that show and talk about the interrelation and interconnectedness of social practices. So changing a practice, starting to use the bike to go to work, may seem like a very simple change of practice, but it has a large influence on other practices that are related. Again, questions of bringing kids to school, maybe the travel distance, maybe also one has to carry a lot of paperwork or tools, for instance, to go to work. And then, of course, these social innovations, these changes of practices that sound very simple, they're actually very difficult to implement in the sense of their interconnectedness with other practices. And there, the idea of social innovations in a certain context comes into play. So there we could say that the existing regime is a web of practices, if you want to try to draw an analogy between this drawing by Geels and the idea of existing practices that have to change, and where a new niche practice starts to rival the existing practices. And what I like very much about the multi-level perspective is the idea that landscape changes can open up windows of opportunity. And that's a topic that is, I think, also under-addressed in a lot of transition research, where there is a focus on niches that have to be implemented in the regime. We need the sustainable alternatives. But the idea that landscape impacts can open up windows of opportunity is often a bit neglected, I think. But it's very interesting also in relation to practice theory and to the idea of implementing social innovations within existing practices. Because for practice theory, Reckwitz writes, for instance, that the breaking and shifting of structure must take place in everyday crisis of routine. So he uses the big word crisis here, of course, but he also shows that there must be a kind of impact on the everyday routines. It needs to be broken up by something external, and in that sense, the idea, I think, of windows of opportunity should be embedded much more also in social innovation research. So there I come towards the end of my talk, but just to go a little bit more into the idea of the practice theory perspective. So if we look at Shove and colleagues, she says that social practices are constituted by the elements of materials, meanings, and competences. And Reckwitz puts a very large emphasis on routinized behavior as a kind of repetition of existing practices, but constituted by these elements. And as I mentioned, Reckwitz then focuses on the need for, or not so much focuses, but it mentions the need for crisis to actually open up the existing practice and to open up the existing regime towards alternatives and toward alternative possibilities for more sustainable practices, although he doesn't refer to sustainability. But that, I think, is a topic that is under-addressed in social innovation research. The idea that social change, practice change, social innovations, they also need to be embedded within existing structures, within existing practices. So they need to find a certain window of opportunity to actually be able to enter the new practices. So with that, I come to the end of my talk. I just want to share one last slide with a bit of my research agenda in this area. I think I addressed a lot of the issues already. But so the main thing, of course, is that sustainable transitions do need social innovation. So they need more sustainable practices. They need also social practices alongside technological innovations. But what is important is that we have a critical approach to social innovation to better understand the dynamics and complexities. So I think a lot of literature is too normative in this sense and assumes social innovations to be good, and therefore also assumes social innovation to be taken up in society. And we see that this is not the case, and asking why is actually relatively rare. So we need to be more critical about what hinders the development of social innovation, especially sustainable social innovations. And so in that, I think what we need is an explicit attention for the embedding of these social innovations in their interaction, interconnectedness, and temporal alignment of new and existing practices. So bringing the social innovations together with the practices that are already out there and within which they need to be integrated. So that's it from my side. Look forward to hearing questions or comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Rick, for this brilliant presentation. It sets us on the right course for thinking the theoretical as well as the normative implications of social innovation and its potential in promoting social technical transitions. I will handle now the stage to Professor Roberto Rivas. But first, I would like to remember those who are following this this session and invite you to post your questions at our chat. So please feel free to send us questions should you have any. So Professor Roberto, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Professor Roberto is holds a PhD in development and planning from Aalborg University. He was also a postdoc with Nord University, where he's currently an associate professor at the Center for High North Logistics. Professor Roberto, thank you for joining us. Looking forward to your talk. You have the floor.
Thanks. I would like to share my slides. Here they are. So in my presentation, I would like to share some theoretical and empirical insights from international shipping within the focus of sustainable socio-technical transitions. First of all, thanks for introducing my background. I'd like to highlight my research areas. I've been doing research on the maritime industry since my PhD studies, and I'm very much interested on the sustainability transitions within the maritime sector, which represents perhaps the most globalized area of the economy, since it covers all the war operations, all ports, logistics systems across different continents, and therefore its impact on the economy is key. So any change, any socio-technical change in this industry is per se an area of great interest, both empirical and theoretical. And I'm interested in issues of cleaner production within the maritime industry and how the innovation process and technology can change takes place. So currently in the Center for High North Logistics, we have a main focus in the Arctic region, but also in the North Sea region in Europe. And my colleagues in this picture, we are running different projects within the center. The center is based in the city of Kirkenes in northern Norway, but we have research base in North University in Buda. So this is Arctic territory, and we collaborate with industry, academy, and several stakeholders in order to understand the logistical aspects of Arctic transportation. We get funding from the Norwegian Research Council, but we have funding from the European Commission, and our research agenda simplified it's within aspects of logistics, but also connected to technological change and cleaner shipping conditions and governance in Arctic and high north regions. Before introducing the big topic of socio-technical transitions, I would like to talk what are the key environmental issues of international shipping. So I would like to highlight the complexity of the maritime sector first. It is extremely divided by different structures, and these structures work out in different phases of the supply chain. So the most obvious and seen infrastructure is ports located in coastal areas, and their function is to load and unload cargo from different kinds of ships, which is the second infrastructure that it's highly visible. The ships sailing around the seas or in inland water systems are also the second key component of this system. But uh, behind the ports and the ships, you have multiple actors like shipping agents, companies specialized in logistics supply that manage logistics in inland transport, for example, trucks or railways that connect to the ports. You also have insurers that are companies specialized to insure the ships and the cargo that it's within these ships. And no ship in the world will sail without an insurance, that's for sure. And in order to get an insurance, you also need to classify your ship. So there are the so-called classification societies that almost each big maritime country has one classification society, and they are a key player to set technical rules about the technologies that are approved to be on board of the ships in order to have a safe sail. So you have then infrastructure as ships, you have infrastructure as ports, logistic providers that connect these ports and ships with railways and with roads. Then you have actors like classification societies and insurers. But In connection to those, you have shipyards and marine equipment and instrumentation suppliers that are part of the construction of the ships and the installation of technology. After some years, these ships needs to be commissioned to repairs or for installing technology that is in line with safety and environmental regulations. And externally, you have a number of research and development organizations, service inputs like the human factor and the human resources in the industry, which is key. So I just wanted to talk about this just to show why on how can we talk about socio-technical transitions in such an industry and which point of departure we take. Similarly, there are challenges connected to international shipping that I'm just focusing here on the environmental and ecological impacts of international shipping, but not discussing the social or human resources aspects of international shipping. So you can see impacts to water, and most importantly, and gain more attention recently, is the impact to air. So it's the ecological impacts of international shipping have consequences on health of coastal communities. They have consequences on the ecosystems, and they have consequences for the state of health of the planet if we think the greenhouse gas emissions. Combining the global fleet of ships in the world, it is calculated that the emission is around 5%, if I'm right, but it's not that one of the highest emitters, but it's an important emitter of greenhouse gases. Recently, there have been serious measures to tackle some of these environmental aspects. In concrete, air pollution has been widely regulated, and one of the obvious things is to reduce the sulfur content in the fuels, fossil fuels that are used in ships. So currently, almost all ships run on fossil fuels. And if you combine the global fleet last month, I checked the global fleet register, and it's around 40,000 ships currently registered of all types. And if you think almost 100% of them are running on fossil fuels, combined gas, natural gas, and bunker, diesel, marine gas oil, and so on. But the problem here has been sulfur content in this, especially in bunker and diesel. And what you can say is that authorities over the years have proved to put limits on the sulfur content because it leads to serious human health issues and acid rain in some areas. So currently, in the circle, point out where we are right now, and in order to accomplish these limits of sulfur content, ship owners have some technical possibilities: either use distillate fuels or switch to other kind of propulsion fuels like natural gas, or use end of pipe technology that gets rid of the sulfur after it goes through the exhaust of the engine. What I want to point out with all this case of sulfur is that this could be like a key area where it can motivate a change, a structural change in the whole industry, to get rid of some of the most polluting technologies and fuels they have right now. But if we see it in a figure comparing radicalness of the expected technological change and the target, we currently see that the shipping industry is very much into incremental changes. If we see the X axis, we see a lot of end-of-pipe technologies, a lot of cleaner production and environmental management systems in place, and these go up to processes and products, business models, and partnerships in the in the Y axis of the graph. So in this red box is what I frame as an interesting area of research to understand socio-technological transition in this maritime industry. So how has been, what is the relation between this problem and STS, which is the big colloquium we have here? That's a very, there are a lot of connections, and I would say that one seat paper of the sociotechnical transitions literature was Frank Gill's paper of 2002, where he put some of the propositions of the multi-level perspective on transitions. And actually that paper was a case study based on the shipping industry and the transition from wind sails, wind propulsion sails, the one as you see in this picture, up to steam as a propulsion technology. So in this paper, Frank Gills set the stage on the historical development of what's the reasons why in the UK this transition took place in the 19th century, and basically was combination of these three levels explained in the previous presentation: micro level, meso level regimes, and evolving socio-technical landscapes. Like in that case, historically, was all the need of connect faster the British Imperium with the colonies, and the sail technology, wind technology became quite outdated to these needs, and at the same time it should keep pace with the industrial revolution taking place with the steam development in other industries. Recently, a group of researchers based in Norway have been using quite a lot the socio-technical transitions in the maritime industry. My colleagues from SINTEF and the TIC in Oslo, and they have been running a project on greening of the Norwegian shipping industry, and they have applied this to the study of ports, for example, this MLP. What could it look like in the maritime industry nowadays? This multi-level perspective, we see it where these three levels here with the niches, the socio-technical regime, which is the one I introduced in the first slide, presenting all the stakeholders and all the key infrastructure. And we see a landscape of evolving societal priorities in terms of expectations and values. Importantly, the new generations that push for end of climate change problems and the need for decarbonize the different industries. A second area of or stream of research within socio-technical theories that has been applied in many studies and connected to maritime industries technological innovation system, abbreviated by TIS. And this theory is very practical because it can focus within a particular technology. It is not studying the whole sector as MLP, but it takes one technology at a time, and within this technology, it analyzes the so-called the functions of the technological innovation system. And in this, these functions are functions like entrepreneurial activities, knowledge development, knowledge diffusion, guidance of the search, market formation, resource mobilization, creation, and creation of legitimacy. What these papers do is to, through qualitative methods like interviews, document review, and so on, they present a picture of the maturity of a given technology in a given point of time. And they point out a possible benchmark about what is needed to make this technology more mature, or what the innovation system in a given country can do in order to provide incentives for the further development of research and development within that particular technology. So these studies have analyzed, for example, wind propulsion and hydrogen, use of hydrogen in ships, and the use of batteries, just like the batteries in cars, but in big ships. I would like to share also our experience and an ongoing project applying sociotechnical change theories and applying transition methods for the analysis of the adoption of greener technologies within the case of wind propulsion in ship. This is part of the project of the Interreg program funded project WASP, and this project is running up to the year 23, and we are a partnership between several countries and organizations in the North Sea region in Europe. And the focus of the Interreg program is to create a network and synergies between industry and academia, but also among regions in Europe that are connected to a particular area. So big narrative in northern Norway has been region connected to sea activities, to the maritime world, but also a region that it's directly affected by the sulfur regulations just previously mentioned. That's why the shipping industry in this area needs to find solutions to reduce fossil fuels consumption, and also become a kind of a platform, a good example to be followed up by the shipping industry in other areas of the world. So many pilot projects are seeing the light right now, not only by Interreg, but by national agencies in the different countries. The examples shown previously with the hydrogen and batteries was from a paper in Norway, and similar studies and projects are being funded at the European level as well. There are several applications of wind-assisted ship propulsion in shipping and the different types of WASP installations. Here is a short overview of what it's these technologies right now. They differ a lot on the cost. They differ a lot on the maintenance cost, and also on what is needed from the operation side of the crew of the ship. And one important thing is that you remember the paper of Frank Giels, 2002, which shows the transition from wind sails to steam propulsion. Well, it's quite of funny that now we want to do a transition back to the wind propulsion shipping, but this means that these technologies shown here not necessarily will mean 100% propulsion by wind. They can be combined with engines or other kind of cleaner propulsion, not relying on fossil fuels. The idea is to reduce from a range of 5% up to 30% the use of fossil fuels during one single voyage of the vessel, depending on the wind conditions. There are a number of operational factors affecting the performance of WASP technology that I want to highlight in this slide here. There are environmental factors, there are onboard factors related to the crew, and there are commercial factors that prevent this technology to be the best solution for every ship sailing around in the North Sea region, for example. So every ship owner has to consider whether these factors, the combination of these factors, it's appropriate for his or her fleet. And there are also some differences between the different technologies in relation to these operational factors. And I just wanted to highlight here two examples, which is kites and flat net rotors. They differ in terms of absolute power, scalability, wind direction, and operation of the ship. One important aspect within the transitions and socio-technical transition research, call it MLP, call it TIS, is the role of regulation or the role of practices, as explained previously, to adopt an emerging technology and this technology to be diffused and adopted by the largest number possible of players in the industry. In this research was my colleagues from the Other World Package. They came up with a number of possible regulation to promote wind technologies, and we see here they range from extreme one like carbon levy, which is being used to this carbon levy or tax can be used to fund or co-fund the installation cost of these technologies in most ships, so it makes more attractive the installation. There are also policies related to speed limits and engine power limitations at sea that in combination with the use of wind propulsion could be attractive. Alignment with CO2 reduction targets, and R&D funds available for research and development, and stricter regulations, and so on, so on. So what wanted to come out is that we can use some of these policies to model what could be the consequences of these different policies in the adoption of wind propulsion technologies by a certain fleet. And I will come back to this in a few seconds, just to exemplify how can we analyze, how can in the practice we can introduce methodologies of innovation and marketing in order to study the diffusion of technologies and also to reflect about transition research agendas. So this is an overview of the 5 pilot ships that are installing the wind propulsion technologies in our project, and we are getting data of these 5 ships and data about installation costs, data about operational costs, data about the savings on fuels. And we will introduce this data as input for our model in combination with the different policies that can be used to promote wind propulsion. And this is what I wanted to share. This is a working paper, so it's still not finished and we're still working on this, but I want to share a bit the idea, what we want to achieve. And we model the adoption of different wind propulsion technologies depending on the policy combination. What we do in the computer program is we create general set of steps. We'll go quite in the general terms here. What we have is a fleet to be retrofit. Let's say a population of vessel of 8,000 vessels. that have heterogeneous features. This population of vessels, we take their data from the World Ship Register, Clarkson. So we know what could be, in theory, their fuel consumption per year. And then what we do is there are some marketing models of diffusion of technologies and awareness about a given technology, a given product, called the BAS model. So what we do here is to understand the role of demonstration project, past experiences, and networking. There are some equations that we can put in this model to say, okay, if we have a fleet of 8,000 vessels and they are in a network model, on a social network, how and they all of them start without knowledging of wind propulsion technologies, but they network, and then one of them installs the technology. Then what will happen? How many of them will become aware? Then we go to the next steps, which is an evaluation of the technology by the shipping companies, and the decision then is to have an adoption or not of one of the three technologies we model. Call it Flettner rotors, call it sails, and so on. But you will tell me, okay, but here, where do you put the policies? Well, that's interesting of modeling such system with real data, and we could actually include the different scenarios in the last steps, which is where the shipping companies will take into account financial values like the net present value of the investment, for example, and that will be affected by a combination of policies like the taxes or subsidies or research and development. So we put in our model, we put these scenarios in the last part, and we model this through running cycles, a 30-year period. The results will look a bit like this, and how can this be explained in relation to the transitions research agenda is okay. We see, for example, the role of incentivization policies by reducing installation cost and taxing fuel consumption. Obvious, and if in this figure we have 4 graphs. Each one of these graphs relate to one of the technologies, 3 of them to one of the 3 studied wind propulsion technologies, and one of them relates to the business as usual, that it's a vessel running only with fossil fuels. And the most yellow, the color in the graph means less percentage of vessels adopted that solution, and the darkest in blue means more vessels adopted that technology. So this is how we get the results in this model, and we can see obvious issues that are more related. And what could be interesting from these results is not that, of course, if you have more subsidies to wind propulsion and high fuel costs, of course, less vessels will depend on fossil fuels because they will find solutions like wind propulsion. This is what we see in the top left figure. But it's more interesting is the other 3 graphs, where we see that there could be certainly some differences on the technologies, and they are because there could be small variations, sensitive variations on the price of maintenance, price of installation, and of course the total fuel saves. That is something new to the literature we bring and compare to previous research, and also that certainly it's necessary to see the details of the different technologies, because it could make more sense, for example, to invest in technologies that gain wind propulsion technologies that bring higher fuel saving potential, but their installation and investment cost is certainly prohibitive for many shipping companies. Just to wrap up my presentation, my 30 minutes, I would like to set some concluding remarks and some reflections. The maritime transportation industry is a critical case. We have seen this, that socio-technical transition theories like MLP and TIS have been widely used for researching the socio-technical change within this industry. And it expected more research within this area to come in the future. In our research in the WASP project, we intend to contribute to the socio-technical transitions literature, because there was some call some years ago in the community to use agent-based modeling techniques in order to simulate these transitions, and that's how I connect my research to this area. We have also seen that air pollution and propulsion is the most studied environmental aspect so far, connected to transition analysis. There are also some serious gaps in terms of social aspects. For example, shipyards, end of life of ships, or work conditions of seafarers is less studied, even though the critical COVID situation last 2 years show the critical situation of seafarers worldwide, but this is surprisingly not studied. There's a lot of focus on the technology, on the decarbonization, on issues like wind, but not about the people behind and the ships. Global reach of the industry is also a challenge for socio-technical transition to place at speed rate. What published research show is really big focus on research on niches of technologies within predefined geographical regions like Northern Europe, and WPT technologies, wind propulsion technologies, or hydrogen. But we don't have a lot of research on socio-technical transition and other places like the Japanese, for example. They are been also doing a lot of research and development on green shipping. And China and Korea are big players in the maritime construction business and the logistical value chain worldwide. But research focusing on transition in the maritime industry in Korea and China is not there. And decarbonization of the industry as a core socio-technical imaginary. Right now, I didn't talk about socio-technical imaginaries, but it's another topic I'm very interested on. And we see that this decarbonization is kind of the totem right now and is becoming a big imaginary in the literature. I would like to thank for the invitation again, and I welcome your comments and inputs during the next discussion. Thanks a lot.
By all means, thank you, Roberto, for this brilliant presentation. You brought forward some elements that help us grasp the potential of this kind of technology, the promising side of it, and how it all fits with the perspective of promoting social technical transitions. So thank you very much for that. We have quite a few questions in the chat. I would like to bundle up a few of them. Maybe we do a couple rounds of key questions and answers. So I'll begin with Melissa Bertolini's question. She said, eco design is an amazing practice and essential for circular economy, both social innovation practices towards sustainability. But how exactly is it possible to, how exactly is it possible to establish or even talk about global standards for new social practices when we have multi-actor technical social realities. This question connects to Sergio Astorga's questions also. He asked, do you think that these analytical frameworks can be extended for application to empirical case studies in other contexts, such as Latin America or in peripheral economies? So I would like to discuss. I would like to hear your thoughts on these questions, and also add another question of my own. So, what sort of experiences from the global South do you consider are interesting or present relevant examples of possibilities regarding social technical transitions? So I'll, I would like to hear your thoughts on these questions. Maybe we can start with Rick, please.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting questions indeed. Yeah, so the topic of eco-design is actually really interesting. I studied industrial design myself in my bachelor, so it's like now 15 years ago or so. And then the concept of eco-design was one of the keywords, the buzzwords that are going to be the future. And what's interesting to see, of course, is how long it actually takes. Again, also here for these practices to become established. And not an expert in the field at all. Also not when it comes to standardization. But I did write a paper once, actually as a student, not so much of a paper, but a little student work on standardization in color industry in painting. So we have these color codes, and they transfer a certain code, a certain color through a code. And what you see there, of course, is that there is a certain need from all sides. So the producers, they need to be able to have a very clear, be able to communicate the color very clearly to their customers. Customers need to know exactly which color they're receiving when they order something. So there is a very clear need within a very well-defined group. And I think this is one of the challenges when it's about eco-design. It's not a very well-defined group of actors. It's a multi-actor process indeed, as was also mentioned in the question, I think. And there's not a very clear alignment of needs and wants and expectations there, because there are, of course, competing interests. And that makes standardization, I think, very difficult. So again, I'm not an expert there, but I think that plays an important role. Yeah, maybe moving on directly to the question of Global South and also using these frameworks in, for instance, Latin American country. I think definitely ideas like multi-level perspective can be used in other countries as well. Also, the concept of social innovation. But what's important is always to keep in mind, I think, that a lot of these terms, especially when it's about multi-level perspective, they were developed based on mainly European case studies and on European context. So you have to translate that a little bit to the local context. So if it's about the regime, one should always ask, like, what is the relevant regime? Or also when it's about interconnected practices that have to do with sustainability or unsustainability. The practices or the regime, they may differ a bit from country to country. There may be different expectations about, maybe when it's about mobility, about the car as a certain status symbol. That's also very different even within European countries. Don't know enough there about Latin American context or also Global South in an even broader way. But those are things to keep in mind and to study within your case analysis. And then I think these frameworks are very useful to see, okay, what are the very stabilizing elements, and what are also the elements that may have the potential for creating a window of opportunity. So what are the weaker elements where maybe it is possible to create a certain change, and where maybe also a landscape impact can have an impact on the existing practices.
Thank you very much, Rick. Over to you, Roberto.
Yes, thanks a lot. And relation to the first question, which is about eco-design and global standards that that could be aligned to new social practices, but at the same time, these social practices differ across cultures. That's what I understood from the question, where we could have an universal eco-design applied to a certain product, and then the practices connected to that transition in that eco-design product could be the same across countries, if I got right the concern from the question. Well, what I could do some because this is not the area of my research, but I could provide some ideas to what I think of what happens here. Well, first of all, there should be eco design when you apply an eco design process. It should consider the usability in context of the product you're designing, and that will also have an impact on the culture that this product is intended to be used. So the social practice should be included into the design phase and consider the implications to the culture that will use or be the user of that particular product. So I think that a global standard for, let's say, a bottle of an eco-design bottle of bio-based thermo uh, will have different meanings in Brazil or in Norway, for example, depending on where people it's used to wash and reuse that bottle every day, or just purchase in the traffic light bottle of water every day that they wait for the green light, like in the traffic jam in Sao Paulo, for example. So in that sense, I would expect that this practice will be considered depending on the design of the product. Linking this to my field of experience with the ships and technologies that you have on on big products like ships, and complex and big products like ships or cars or airplanes. There you need global standards. Why? Because then you're talking about insurers, you're talking about a whole system of insurers and authorities that will certify that this product is conform to safety regulations, and then the role of social practice it's also integrated when the usability of a component, for example, wind propulsion technologies, is considered into the safety of the crew of the boat. So I will say shortly, to answer your question, the eco design should integrate the social practice within the design cycle to make it useful for the context it is used. In relation to the second question, whether the analytical frameworks of socio-technical transitions have usability in the global south, I would say that this is a kind of always existing question in the community of sociotechnic STRN, as this Sustainable Transitions Research Network has put this question. I started attending their conferences in 2012. And by then, they shared the research agenda, and this was already there. And there has been, as you know, a group doing reflections about the use of this framework in the global south. There is research that since then has been published, and what even though these concepts appear in like the case of I show in the context of the UK and the transitioning shipping there, or a lot of research on the ports in Northern Europe and so on. But I see that there have been publications on applying these concepts in the agricultural transition in global south countries. I've seen publications on water resource in urban contexts in the global south as well. So I would say this literature is still not like in terms of theoretical development, like setting new frameworks like the TIS or MLP, but they are providing important understanding of transition dynamics in the global south, and certainly there is opportunity to use them. Um, from the two examples presented here, I would say that TIS seems to be more fit to understand given sector in the global south. For example, now there are a lot of discussions about the bioeconomy and how to instead of using plastics, just use similar and analogous product, but an analogous uh, material coming from nature, like fibers or some kind of biomaterials from the sea, like algae and so on. So that kind of research is very fit for the global south because it's rich in natural resources, and there is a whole war of research and development on natural resources in these countries. But it will be interesting to see these applications more in the literature.
Thank you both for your thoughts on these questions. Uh, there's there are other comments here, so I still invite people who are following us, if you care to join in the questions and comments of the chat. But I'll read through Tiago's thoughts, in which he says, Rick mentions the vagueness and instrumentalization of the concept of social innovation. Nevertheless, he defended the use of the concept. That reminds me of a quote from Fritz Machlup, an Austrian American economist. A term which has so many meanings that we never know what its users are talking about should be either dropped from the vocabulary of the scholar or purified of confusing notations. I also I was very curious at that point at Rick's talk when you mentioned that a common critique is that the concept of social innovation is fairly vague. And personally, I think that critique is a bit unfair, right? Because it could be applied to innovation simply as a whole. It's also a very vague term, but it's consistently used in different spaces, areas, and fields. But so I was very hooked up on that question, and Tiago brought the same issue here. So he asks, what what would you say, Rick and Roberto, on behalf of continuing using those concepts that are making quite a fuss, but seem to be prone to different uses? That has to do with another intervention from Michele Alves, who asks, what problems do you believe that still exist in the current context in trying to incorporate the social technical approach within the university? So both these questions, they lead us to think, how far along are we in creating a consensus about these concepts and using them as part of a consistent field of research or an epistemic field. Your thoughts on that, please? Maybe we start with Roberto this time.
Yeah, in terms of the continuing using concepts that have unclear meaning or that could be so-called buzzwords, that's a big issue right now, not only in sociotechnical or the transitions field, but in general in sustainability field, which is the area I research on. So we have the case of circular economy, for example, that or eco-innovation, among others, that became popularized, and at some point they can have different or create different meanings. But I will obviously there are reviews that try to 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 summarize these meanings and provide definitions, and these reviews are cited and they provide kind of agreement in the academia. But what I see, it's maybe more difficult and has implications for society, is the imaginary, that concepts as maybe not social innovation, but circular economy brings to policy and practice. We have done some research about this, and in the context of Norway, we have a working paper on that. And what we see is that such terms or definitions are suddenly portrayed in the government discourse in ways that bring different imaginaries, and that could lead from circular economy as understood as just eco-efficiency, or a slight weight of eco-modernization, that it's just to optimize the collection of waste and the recycling and improve these practices in the companies. But also it can contradict a bit with expectations of creating more from actors at the municipal, regional government, to create so-called circular regions with that the industry is connected in a way of uh, industrial symbiosis, that is, that the products of one company is input, or the waste of one company is inputs to the other, and that food production takes place at within very connected supply chains in the region, without relying too much um, on international shipping for bringing that. So you see, this is very different from one understanding of circular economy to the other, and this is just in government documents available in the government portal of Norway. So that means that having this in big concepts and using them in the academia, even if we agree on a definition, doesn't mean that practitioners and politicians will have the same understanding, and that will have implications in the policy making in the real world. So if you say that one imaginary promoting more eco-efficiency will make into a national circular economy package, for example, that promotes this eco-efficiency, instead of circular economy understood more like this regional transition area. So that's a reflection on why it's important to have this definition clear. And the second question, which is related to, I couldn't get much clear the question, if you refer to the use of sociotechnical approach within the university, but more about um, in your own research agenda, or uh, yeah, or the university as an actor within transitions in a given area, given sector. So it wasn't clear for me, but what I could say in relation to universities and sociotechnical um, research and approach is that there have been interesting research about the role of intermediaries in transitions, for example, in the energy sector, renewable energies, and so on. This has been kind of an area of research where they have looked into the role of universities and so on. So I would say that this research point out that one possible problem could be the so-called lock-in patterns. That it's that the universities are um, are often within some traditions, some routines, and that also relates to the ways they are connected to the region. And if this university is pretty much working with the oil and gas industry, for example, then that will prevent more uh, more openness to renewable energies, and that I see this as a possible answer to your concern, looking more into the intermediaries literature and sociotechnical transitions, and also looking into lock-in dynamics within the universities are fit.
Thanks, Roberto, for sharing your thoughts on that. Rick, over to you, please.
Yeah, I can agree with a lot of what Roberto just mentioned. But yeah, coming back to Tiago's question, social innovation. Yeah, I definitely wouldn't say it needs to be dropped altogether. It definitely needs to be purified, and that's definitely true. Maybe just a quick reference to the transition area, because just I think 5-6 days ago, paper has been published there. Just looked it up by Julian Kircher, who writes "Bullshit in the Sustainability and Transitions Literature: A Provocation." That's the title of his paper, and he argues that up to 50% of all articles being published on the topic are scholarly bullshit. It's a bit of a provocation, as in the title, but it shows that yeah, as Roberto also mentioned, it often a lot of the work they're just keywords being used, buzzwords being used, and they don't add a lot to the literature. And that's definitely the same also in social innovation research, where we have indeed, as Roberto also mentioned, the challenge of the political instrumentalization of the term versus a academic understanding that needs to be brought together, needs to be united. Whereas, especially because the topic is politically so important, at least in Europe, but actually across the world, academia somehow probably has to react and has to study what are social innovations and has to work towards the definition. And that is, of course, difficult if there are different approaches. So it's a kind of also our task probably to try to purify this area. And that's also what I try to do. And of course, in my presentation, I try to give a bit of a broader overview of the different understandings of social innovation. But as you may have noticed, especially in the first part of my talk before I went towards defining social innovation, I mainly used the idea of practice, changes of social practices, because that is for me what social innovation is about social practice and smaller or bigger changes therein. So I sometimes also consciously try to avoid using the term social innovation too much, because we need to agree on what we're talking about. At the same time, the little bit vagueness of the term also has, of course, some advantages, because it allows us to study different phenomena that I think are to some degree related, but on different levels. So if we talk about use of cargo bikes, we can study that as a potential social innovation that maybe becomes some point adopted or largely adopted within a city or even within a country, and we can do country comparisons, while at the same time do very micro studies on what motivates people to adopt this novel practice, what are their social practices in which this new practice interacts. So we can have a bit of a intermediate level where we can both understand larger changes and larger structural changes with the changes of individual practices. So there I must say that I also just use this academic leeway a little bit, this freedom that the term also gives us. Yeah, so in terms of the second question, also not quite sure whether I interpreted correctly, but what I would maybe add to Roberto's answer is that what we see in many universities that they have kind of it's called the Center for Entrepreneurship and Transfer. So it's about getting technologies usually developed within the university and bringing them to the market. And traditionally, these offices are very much focused on technology, but also on entrepreneurial drives, on creating businesses, earning money. One thing we see there is that there's an increasing understanding there also as a role of universities as a location for social innovations, in the sense of new local practices, where also these centers for entrepreneurship and transfer or technology transfer offices, where we see that they are becoming more interested also in maybe less technological solutions and definitely also less commercial solutions. So much more about solving usually local practices and they're helping maybe also to some degree to integrate the university within an urban landscape in the sense of, well, spreading ideas that maybe students have that develop within the university on a campus to usually more locally, but maybe also spreading wider, have some positive impacts on sustainability and livability of the area.
Great. Thanks to you both for sharing your thoughts on these questions. Uh, we're coming to a close now, so maybe I'll hand the word back to you so you can share your final thoughts on any topics that you feel relevant regarding this general theme we addressed today. So I'll just ask you to very briefly wrap up with some final thoughts on these themes, please. So maybe we can go back to Rick first, please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for again also the invitation and possibility to talk here. There's one question maybe by Thiago in the chat that I can relate to also in his closing remarks. It's about whether there's a new field dealing with sustainability transitions. I think that's definitely the case in the area of also with the international sustainability transitions conferences that are being organized every year. There we also see a research network addressing exactly these topics of sustainability transition, socio-technical change. And what I think, what I also try to show in my presentation is that there we need more integration of social innovation, social practice change, and their interaction with sustainability transitions. So that would be my final comment, where I think there's a lot of interaction going on already between the fields of social innovation research, transition research, but yeah, more cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary collaboration and learning can definitely help move the field forward, and also then of course help hopefully move the practice forward towards establishing these more sustainable practices.
Thanks, Rick. Roberto, please.
Yeah, thanks also a lot for the good exchange of ideas. I see also there is a last question for me here from Tiago. From Tiago asking, when speaking of maritime transportation industry, bringing us a lot of empirical elements. Roberto mentioned to other sociotechnical imaginaries related to maritime industry. For instance, big tourist ships, and we could add harmful fishermen practice. What challenges for those communities? Yes, we could say that it's very complex, the maritime industry, because it covers, I forgot this big cruise industry, the fisheries, but also the oil and gas industry in the Arctic, which is critical and very controversial. You also have the military and so on, so on. So it's very difficult to right now to have a transition or using that we are talking about concepts and buzzwords. Using those concepts of socio-technical transition to address any and all of these areas in the maritime industry. I know that a lot of people and researchers are addressing these concerns. For example, there are projects about governance of the cruise industry in the Arctic that are tackling issues of how to make a cruise industry more responsible when bringing tourists to Svalbard archipelago, for example. But such research, they incorporate some transition elements, and one of their papers looks into the commons and the relation with transition and polyedric governance practices, for example. So they incorporate, but I see it's a huge research within the cruise industry. Then you have the huge sector of fisheries and governance of fisheries that I would like to go into that, but there is a lot of research about fish quotas, about technologies, about eco labels in fisheries. That is the area I know a bit more, but certainly it's possible to understand transitions or apply this transitions concept in all these areas. And I hope another person, I think it's what Sergio Astorga asked about his case in Mexico, and I hope I answer his question in my previous in the previous part when you also ask about the use of these concepts in the global south. So thanks a lot for the discussion.
Thank you both, Rick and Roberto. It was very brilliant discussion, I would say. You brought some relevant themes, and many of them will definitely resonate for quite a time. We'll be able to revisit the recording of this talk. It's available on the YouTube channel. And I also take this opportunity to invite you all to join the STS Colloquium on June 9th in the 7th session about public communication of science and technology. So once again, thank you, our guests, and thank you all for joining us in this session today. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Thank you.